Oh, good. It was off. Glad I remembered to turn it on. Hi. Um, Super happy to have a couple people commenting. Thank you. It definitely makes it more fun and more real, and that's what I'm going for. Yeah. Sorry, I can't think of your username off the top of my head. I want to say the word name Mike was in it. I'm going to call you Mike. You had requested 1800, since I was thinking about it for a couple days, like, oh, what would I be into also for 1800s? And then I didn't actually get a um, share my summer research project that I started. And then I was asked to change the narrative and just everything I was doing. It was my first paid research project apart from like being in K through 12 school. And so I was so excited to do it. And then just everywhere I was going with the mentors who were overseeing my research project, they wanted me to do what they wanted. So, and that included like speaking of Native Americans in a certain way, and then speaking of, or not talking about, whorehouses in the 1800s, because all major industries, and especially up here in the north, had whorehouses. And so I'm not going to not talk about that because that's a real scar. And I was talking about it in a way that was both real and in line with other uh, times in history where growing industries have produced whorehouses. And so we're in college, and it's ironic because they want to talk about changing children's genitals, but I can't talk about whorehouses in the 1800s in the North. So I was like, well, no, you can take this last $250 and you should pay me because you promised for my idea that you would pay whatever the stipend was throughout the summer. And then up until the last bit, I just said no, because I'm not changing what, first of all, I already told you the direction I was going. I said, I'm going to do the people of Superior, Wisconsin, in order to figure out what happened here. It's a real sad city. It's actually like on record. A news reporter locally named Briggs LaSavage did an awesome report in the fall talking about how the parishes in Superior, Wisconsin, so they've been a 30,000 people population, not even, for over a decade. So they do not grow. And a lot of people who work there come from other places. And they all, or not all of them, but a majority of the parishes, I think her statistic was 105 parishes, 23,000 households out of just like 28,000 people. Um, and the child sex abuse was present in uh, almost every parish for um, 20, was it 25 priests had been accused or alleged of child sex abuse, but they didn't act on it till after 23 were dead, or 20 out of the 23 were dead, whichever it was, 20 out of 23 or 23 out of 25. Um, and the just this fall in Superior, Wisconsin, and thank you again, Briggs LaSavage. That was awesome to do. Reporting on, she got the priest to say, quote, "We are sorry if the wounds are still fresh." God bless. So, and you'll see it if you travel to the city ever. It is a decrepit city, and it's a disgusting city. There's some great people. It's a horrifying, crumbling, disgusting city. I think one of their city council members was in a sex scandal in the fall as well. One of their police officers ran somebody over in the alleyway. WDIO, who Briggs LaSavage posted on both KBGR and WDIO, some of our local news channels. Um, that and maybe it was her or somebody else, that they ran over somebody in an alleyway this summer, the Superior Police Department. And literally the article was like, he didn't see him there and he thought he hit somebody else because the officer did a hit and run and he didn't get fired. And then another officer, sadly, a little later in the summer, killed a 23-year-old drunk driving, hit a group of kids in a car. So yeah, like young people in their 20s, maybe a teenager was in there too, and killed the 23-year-old. Just a real piece of shit police department. Go look on their reviews on Google. They deserve their 2 out of 5 stars. They actually deserve a 1 out of 5. But anyway, so I'm not one to just let history go. So obviously I wanted to know, like, okay, well, how did a city that once built the ships for World War II, we're in the Twin Ports, Duluth, Minnesota, Superior, Wisconsin, used to be a huge shipyard. There actually weren't cities in the canals. It was just a massive shipyard. And how did people once great who grew so quickly fall so hard? And so, or where did those people then move to, right? And so there were other reasons. I was going out to Kalispell, kind of looking for answers, because again, these aren't, the Twin Ports isn't a place where sex trafficking survivors can get resources or help in any way, shape, or form, which is something I learned living here and surviving that. And so a organization had started in 2017 called Deliver Fund. And then I learned that there was an office in Whitefish, Montana. And then I had been re-trafficked in the spring. And so I was like, well, fuck it. I'm like not able to move forward in life. I won't have children if I don't know where they can be safe. So I'm just going to do 2 things at once. I keep doing my research project because I know people would have migrated that way, because it was the migration to the West, which was something I was wanting to add into my report, talking about how so many people found love and a new kind of freedom after settling in Middle America and then doing the second westward expansion past the Great Lakes through Montana to the west. And so yeah, I did. It was actually really therapeutic to keep doing my research while looking for an answer from this awesome organization that is just starting to get answers themselves. Thank you, Nick McKinley. Alrighty. So I have my thing on my computer. I'm not going to read it off my phone because I don't want to strain my eyes. So I guess I kind of remember it fairly well. And that was the other thing, is it was easy to like think of my research while I was driving. It's an awesome drive. So I'll actually start with my justice's opinion, which I posted all over the university and nobody liked. Well, maybe somebody did. I don't know. It actually stayed up for a week before people took it down, which was fine. No, it went better than I think I'm thinking it went. At least the conversation changed to something relevant. So this is my justice's opinion, and I posted it below. Okay. This is like kind of the opinion of my research and my time here this past decade. Yeah, I've always loved America. But then I was like, wait, what happened to it? So accurate American history, when analyzed independently, is more a history of betrayal and retribution so far. What it has yet to become, excuse me, speaking over myself and my opinion. What it has yet to become is a history of vengeance for the purpose of justice, like the promise is meant to require. Throughout American history, statistically, there has been zero precedent set in the defense of individual independent citizens. So like 0.0001% is my gathering. A statistical zero. Precedent defined, a case that controls the narrative on the introduction for comparison later. And so I want to explain what I mean. So I mean, like, we have large court cases. So in like the 1800s, including slavery, you have like small cases where people with indentured servitude or enslavement could argue in local courts for their freedoms using like the Declaration of Independence if they were able to read. And there are small cases of doing that. But because so much has happened, and then because there's been so much betrayal of independent liberty and original American values, though that's pretty much it. Everything else was like, only if we can make this a big deal and tie other things into it. Pork, I think, is a phrase of our government. Of when you like are saying you're doing something for justice, but you're like fattening it up so you can get the most out of crying a big old fucking river. So that's what I mean. They're really in these past, well, since then to slavery, and including the like gaining traction for that political era. It's all just been for groups, and it's been levied where it's like, this is the group for the individual, not this is an individual arguing their birthright in a court against the state, against the city, and against the federal government, any mixture of those. Or an individual against any large entity that's violating their original birthright, which is the Declaration of Independence. And however you would argue that, I would like to see more creativity just from arguing the Declaration of Independence in local courts. I think that would be huge. And I think that would help bring people down from whatever academic high they raise themselves on that is so far from the origin. And actually like working against, I think, what a lot of people intend to do or what they want their outcome to be. Okay, then this is touching on my research opinion of my own research. It was a lonely semester. Most European immigrants after 1840 did not care about freedom. They were just cold, homeless, and starving. Most peoples from early American diplomatic change were looking for more stability and less inevitable betrayal, usually from within their own families and land-owning groups worldwide. So for Wisconsin in the later 1800s, it was mainly a bunch of Irish and a bunch of Germans. And then the smaller ethnicities for more specialized jobs were like the Swiss, the Finnish, the Swedish, because they could work in wet, cold. And then they had usually just more specialized skills in these smaller populations. The Irish were starving to death in the potato famine. So a lot of what was being sold to Europe was actually like propaganda from like Wisconsinites themselves who were Irish. And a lot of people were looking to land grab and gain control for their religion, for their ethnic group, or because they genuinely felt a compassion for these people who they shared great-great-grandparents with. And so there would be like pamphlets set to Ireland and to Germany and other places, and they would say things like, "Oh my God, this farmland in Wisconsin, you got to come get this farmland." And so the motivation was they were just starving to death. Freedom, they would have come in 1776 if they were really hot and heavy about that freedom. They were not. That's why they said, no, we'll just stay here. It'll get better because we're going to pray to Jesus. And then mass starvation. And they came and took what they could, and then in the places that attracted them. I didn't cover New York at all. And then I just don't remember from basic American history how that played out. Obviously, like Boston and New York have huge Irish ancestries originally, and then after the potato famine. But yeah. And I think a lot of people could read the writing on the wall for the way the aristocracy in Europe was crumbling completely. Excuse me, I've been getting the worst scratch in my throat. All right. And that was it. That was my opinion on my paper. And just what I'd studied this past decade as a whole. Yeah. I actually would want your guys' opinion, my viewers. Because it's interesting to think you have this huge story of the American Revolution heard back in Europe, right? I'm going to get a tablespoon of honey. One sec. All right. Thank you. Thank you, bees from Little Falls, Minnesota. So obviously, and even before that, you had legends back in Europe about the native warriors, and like that, I think a lot of people originally were afraid to move for that reason, because I know there were a lot of books and like stories about like natives, like people would just talk about what those battles were like in like the French Indian War, and I wonder how much that fear kept a lot of like some Irish and Germans from coming over. And it wasn't until they were like, no, come here, it's fine now, that they were actually like, felt secure enough to make that journey, or like it was worth it. Like now freedom was worth it because somebody made it safer for me. I don't know. Yeah. And then, gosh, who was it? Then it was Victoria. I'm so bad at like exact dates in the 1800s, but that's pretty much like Edwardian and then Victorian England, like the Industrial Revolution. And it was like some jobs would be like, do you want to dig through all this shit that we just scooped off the sidewalk because people are throwing shit out their windows still? And do you want to see if you can find a button that you can get some mushy peas and trade for at the end of the day? You want to do that? Or do you want to come work in this new chemical factory? Who knows? So it was like farmland sounds great. And so, do you want to maybe have a war with Russia in one hot second? Because that's always about to happen in the Industrial Revolution of Europe. Do you want to do that? Or do you want to go get some farmland in Wisconsin? Just to think of like the mindset of those people. So a lot of people chose to like Wisconsin. And it must have been very special to them because Wisconsin hasn't had a lot of growth, a lot of potential, not a lot of growth. Yeah, not a lot of farming either anymore. Like some, but not what your great grandparents would have imagined, the flourishing farmlands of Wisconsin. Yeah. Let me actually look through. I touched on a lot of like specific things. There was this really awesome series, the Native American stuff, just, the Ojibwe massacred the Fox tribe in Superior. So there was that genocide by the Ojibwe. Just to mention, so we don't forget to honor Native history here as truthfully as it happened. And there must have been some diplomacy in the 1850s. I think that started to crumble a lot. And then as well with new people, they're not going to understand even how to talk to the Native groups. I did mention like some communities, it was actually cool to learn about in northern Wisconsin. Like there were some Welsh communities and like ones that were smaller and that were actually able to have the time and the space to trust and like move towards just surviving the winter together. And so I think it went better up here because of those smaller groups. And then the Welsh like weren't drinkers, which would also come to bite them in the butt. Because when you have a community of people that don't know the effects of alcohol, well, it's a weapon that can be used against you. And then two, it's just like an ignorance. So when like you start to do that in normalcy, Superior used to have like 500 bars or just something crazy. Again, all the child rape. So you can understand why they'd want to drink more later at a certain point. That's my opinion on that. And then those, now they're down to like, then it was not fun. So whatever happened at those bars, another sad story because it's not like that anymore. But people, when I would interview people, because I wanted to do like interviews for my project, then you had to do like a bunch of paperwork to get like approval to interview people. So I thought, well, I'll just like familiarize myself. So when I go look to do my research, I'm doing it based off of what people have said is relevant to them who live here. And again, I grew up across the bridge in Duluth when I was doing that project. And so totally different cultures, what they evolved to, but they have a similar origin, again, in like the shipping yard, farming stuff. Yeah. I guess it is kind of interesting to notice, though, that Wisconsin is more like Irish German, and then Duluth, Minnesota was like more Norwegian, Finnish, Swedish. And again, I think that's because it was smaller groups that stayed together with more specialized skill. So they were able to make more money and then not fall victim to betrayal within their own families and social circles. People. Okie dokie, guys. I'm a little insecure that I don't remember my entire paper. Okay, so the series I was reading, and it was awesome because it talked about like all the different ethnic groups in the 1800s that came here. So it was called Frontier Village. No, let me make sure. These were all separated by like Norwegian, Danish. Okay, no, this series was just called whatever the ethnicity in Wisconsin, and it was from the Wisconsin Historical Society Press, and they had varying authors. Some authors took on more than one ethnic group. I'll scroll down to that in a little bit. Because this one, I wanted to read this quote. This is one of my favorite quotes from the whole project. And I guess this part from my paper I do want to say because it supports my opinion. So this is from the book Frontier Village, The Birth of Superior, Wisconsin, 1853 to 1883, I guess when it was officially a city. So people had no better option. So people with no better option had their mind set on owning their own land and determining their own future. This meant moving west, settling and claiming land, and stabilizing regions. The government would be taking in millions of Europeans starving to death or facing permanent servitude in the mid-1800s to whatever aristocracy or land-owning lords they lived under. There were many routes people could take when moving westward. Each had its own set of dangers, consequences, and cost. For people in the north, the weather was a major consideration. Many of the first Europeans to settle in the Superior region were from northern countries. James J. Hill, a railway magnate, once said, "Give me snuff, whiskey, and Swedes, and I'll build a railway to hell." Northern people knew what to wear and the best diet suited to withstand freezing wet cold. Also, those allied with the natives were able to learn survival techniques. I have no idea because this didn't come up in any of the readings, and I just haven't learned about it either way. But we also have a really old Norwegian history. So the French were here in like the 1600s, and then Mr. Leif Erikson here was here, I think, in like 900. Excuse me. So I wonder how many times the Norwegians had actually said, we're not going to deal with the aristocracy. That's not really their culture. And so they, for a while, would have just, like kept to themselves. And so I wonder how much, for what we think we know today, we underestimate the back and forth between Great Lakes tribes and Norway. I don't know. And I forget like Leif Erikson's story, only that he was like an explorer. And he was here, and there's a statue of him in Duluth. It's a really beautiful statue. So it is really beautiful, actually, because he's like looking like outward and dressed in like fur. And I love the statue. It's at a really nice park called Leif Erikson Park. It has a super beautiful rose garden in the summer. Yeah. So I wonder if they had like a lot of old, and I feel like the natives were way more separate than like, because they really, with like politics nowadays in particular, like group themselves. But you would have been pretty spread out, and if you didn't want to talk to like your second cousin or like that chief or matriarch, you wouldn't. And there was so much space along the Great Lakes. And the Ojibwe as well have their origin story of like coming from the east. So I wonder, and they did genocide the Fox tribe. So I wonder if the Norwegians had some really old relations that lasted up through the French fur trade. Yeah, comment if you know. Okay, moving on my paper. Yeah. And again, you have a lot of people. So again, these people didn't fight for freedom. They were not in the American Revolution. Their grandparents were not in the American Revolution. The concept of freedom wasn't, it was what they were sold. So that's actually what I learned in a huge way from this project. Because a lot of the propaganda for people coming here was like, so for like the Norwegians who came in the mid 1800s, it was a lot of textile stuff. So like the Swedish and the Norwegians had a lot of brightly colored garments. They would like loom these fantastic patterns. And then they were told by like the cotton industry, like, oh, that's not American. That's too colorful. That's not American. We don't wear that here. And again, fear of competition, because like shit, that would sell really well in New York. That would sell really well in Louisiana. And so they were actually told it was un-American to wear like these Norwegian, Swedish patterns. And they were sold plain white cotton instead. And and if you look in the photos in this series, the people of Wisconsin, ethnic group insert at the beginning, you can tell it's like a dulled down version because it's like the little embroidered flower and like maybe just white and then red and just white and then one other color. Blue came up a lot, but they were not at all what had just been traditional to them. And like, I think most people know what I'm talking about. They have fantastic colors and patterns in a lot of their traditional clothing. So that was interesting. So America wasn't sold, oh, you're coming here. Here's the Declaration of Independence. Know all your rights and don't let anybody trespass on them. It was very much, we're trespassing on you right now. So, yeah. Yeah. And they would sprinkle a little fear on there, like, oh, hate to be un-American and homeless. Yeah. Hate to have to go back to Austria. I don't know. I don't know where the Austrians went. They didn't come yet. I think. God, I wonder what that immigration looks like from Austria, though. I'm watching a series on Netflix called The Empress, and it's about Elizabeth of Austria in the like 1854, actually. I think like right in the middle, 1800s. And it's really interesting. I've only studied like a little bit of Vienna, and it's fascinating. And I wonder what that immigration looks like, actually. I love sugary treats. And Vienna knew how to make frosting. That's a historical fact. Yeah. Okay. Super fluffy, light whipped frosting, like crunchy on the outside. Don't get me wrong, I love like a buttercream that's just like super heavy and like not at all okay to do too much of, but frosting. So yeah, like they were just sold the propaganda, and then a lot of it became to be like food abundance. Like I said in my title, I'm talking about like those American ideals quite literally were traded for food security. And that's why we're such fatties now. Not to say that that hasn't caused peace and has grown awesome economies. Obviously, it gave me so many frosting options. I love snacks. I really do. And I love being able to cook whatever I want. But the reality is that kind of vie for control and land ownership did override the Declaration of Independence and individual liberties. So moving on. You might say treason in some cases. You might. I don't know. It's up to you. Independent individual viewer, where you want to assign treason in history. It's not up to me. Let me mention Mr. John Hammond. So Hammond, I think I knew his great granddaughter because I think she said it was in the family and she had worked there at this place called the Hammond Bar. I don't know if she meant the namesake, but he would help develop Superior. The federal government wanted to expand railway routes to Superior. So like grants came available. Many merchants and companies raced for control. Quote, monopoly was a game of life for 19th century commerce, from all directions, right? You know, political drama interfered with this economic growth. Some projects took longer than expected, and as a result, economic downturns like the stock market crash in the late 1890s affected both Superior and Duluth. Duluth, Minnesota in the late 1800s, 1880s had the most millionaires per capita in the world. The wealth of wheat is what our town motto should be. Also, we should produce like better grain. I think a GMO grain is high treason. I think it's garbage, actually. And I would love for America to get back to real quality grain production. I'm sure there are different species that don't pervert God's creation as much, but overall, I think it was a major mistake for quantity's sake to genetically modify what is historically like the grain of humanity. And I think there's a lot to still be answered for there. And my grandfather would say he was a wheat farmer. It's my grandpa, Robert Allen. And I baled hay for a little bit as a kid, and I loved it. And General Mills had by then, in the early 90s, completely sold out to China. And so they got their wheat imported from China for their cereal and none of it from Minnesota. And that's a Minneapolis company. So I would love to see that come back. And I think a lot of people would. A lot of people really do just want to get back to land ownership and farming. The society, like, people are looking to determine their own future, and you need to be able to control your food source to do that. You can't have your enemy controlling your basic food source. And I do think we produce too much corn in the States. Driving in that circle, some of the air when I would go through like wherever, like the corn, ethanol, whatever it was hard to breathe in some of those places on my road trip. I was like, fix it, please. Because this place should be like a beautiful stronghold of our country. And it's like, first of all, what do the teens do? It's just stores here and then open space with nothing. Where do people go to determine their future, to have individual independent freedom? Where's the parks? Somebody please do something. And so it's actually really cool because one company, God, I'm going to get your name wrong and I'm sorry, sir. I want to say it was the same guy though who owns Hams Beer, like HAMMS, and he was doing like a CO2 pipe. And I just wondered like if they were going to do some green growth with that, or at least they would have the option to open that up for somebody else to do. I don't know. I loved it, but you could see like that the people, they weren't as happy as they deserved to be in a lot of the cities that I traveled to. And the people themselves, so like it was a great atmosphere. I was like, oh, I love these people. Just build them something, please. And I think that's what a lot of like the Mr. Hammond and James J. Hill wanted, and then Jay Cook as well. So he was a very renowned patriot and financier in Duluth and in the region as a whole. He wanted a railway. Sorry, I'm sure many of them did, but I think it was mainly mentioned that Cook wanted a railway from Duluth through North Dakota, through Montana to Oregon, and then one back down to the cities. And it is weird that we don't have that. We should definitely have that, because you want to talk about like just the freedom of the feeling of freedom you get when you travel and being able to see that part of our country. Some of the greatest native battlegrounds when I was coming back down through southern Montana. That was awesome to see, like the Badlands in North Dakota. I loved that part. And just to imagine like a more consumer or just relaxing railway from where we are in the Twin Ports, both all the way out west, not the Amtrak. And I don't even know where you have to go to get on the Amtrak. I forget. I've been on it a couple times, but I don't remember where I got on it at. And then also down to the cities. That's a discussion over 100 years old. And that just tells you the kind of stubborn Irish German a lot of these people really do come from, including those other ethnicities listed. And there must have been just some real social drama at the time, because you can feel like that same like attitude here. And it's like, can you stop like thinking of the past and think of how you can make things better for your children and your innocent grandchildren? Can you fucking please build the train down to the cities, back up here, and back to Portland? There is literally no downside to it, and you have every ability to make that happen. So hopefully in this 100 years. Yeah. Okay. It was really an awesome drive. I loved it. And I study architecture like a motherfucker. I love analyzing a building, and it's just so beautiful to see all the unique things that have been built here. Duluth has some great buildings. We have some major brownstone buildings and just like huge stones, and then like the tiny neat little brick ones too. And like some of the colors in some of the brick buildings are just super fun. And then to drive out to Kalispell and see another like small population, I guess, and to see a lot of those buildings reflect what we have here, and then to kind of see that story of people's migration a bit more. Kalispell had a lot of Danish women, which was interesting, like older Danish women. And I wanted to get to the Danes in my paper, because what I also learned is a lot of the groups that I thought would have been larger migrating to America in general from Europe were not. So like the Danes, pretty small population. The Swiss, pretty small population, and the Finnish came much later, and they were a very small population. And there was one quote in one of the books that had like a quote from a man at the time. So like, let me find it. Okay, let me come back to the Danes because I don't want to have to go back and forth. My paper's 16 pages long. Okay, so the Norwegians, they were awesome at inventing farm equipment. They could meld iron ore really well. So they were just like a natural, more for like our iron ore region in the north. And then building these, what would become popularly used throughout all of America, which is like plows. I want to say they invented like the tractor as well. Another thing people were criticized for, not just the patterns, but like for wool. So how ironic, we're in the north, and then people would be like, oh, wool, no, buy cotton. And then people still don't like dress right for the winter appearance. Like, let's get some wool going. I just think that's funny that the propaganda would get people to get frostbite in the winter, I guess, while working. I don't really think it's funny, but it's also kind of funny. Talking about the Germans, so Germany had been divided into a bunch of small secular kingdoms in Europe. So that kind of reflected in America. The British had hired massive groups of, I think that it's pronounced Hessians or Hessians, from Europe to fight in the Revolutionary War. And I think they kind of took it on themselves to pick either side, because they weren't really under any king, or like, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't, because that had been the barbarians during Rome, right? Like up in the Germanic region. And so even like the Romans wouldn't go two places. They wouldn't go to Ireland, or they would scurry away. And then they also wouldn't go up to the barbarians in the Germanic region. And then Germany has so many hills and massive trees to literally constantly be professionals of guerrilla warfare at. So that structure of hierarchy and then separate family groups reflected in, like, they weren't anybody's bitch kind of at the beginning of America. They were hired by the British, but again, they were always more independent compared to all the other groups of people under the church or king or whatever aristocracy at the time of the Revolution. And so they reflected that coming to America, where they would stay fairly isolated and independent in that way. And then when later groups of Germans came, I think they would quite literally do like a family lineage. And I actually don't really get it. I'm a little fearful to learn, because I know I had a cattle farmer, again, on Bob Allen's sides. No, my grandma, Aletha Allen. Sorry, Grandma. But she did our genealogy, like dedicated years to it, and would get like personal stories, and she traced back to the Revolution where she could, back to wherever in Europe where she could. And for the German side, it was like these cattle farmers and they would like not want to separate so much that when they would look for a wife, they would, if they could get like a cousin I want to, you want to say like, oh, please let it be a second cousin back in Europe to come forward. But I don't think it was. I think it was the first cousin. And again, like not wanting to, just stresses me out thinking of it. And he had like this story. I actually love that she picked out this story to share because she was completely bold and honest in doing our family history. No, and she was like, yeah, so he married his first cousin, sent her, and their cattle farm was in like Utah area, Nevada area. And he had one cousin come out, didn't like her very much, and then married just her sister, another cousin. And I think the Germans did have a lot of cattle farms. And you'll see in like American history, it's quite odd how our livestock didn't really flourish in like people owning their own livestock source. And I actually wonder how much the Germans in the mid 1800s beginning really were like, well, we're going to control livestock so people can't tell us where to move. And so we can land grab more and hide more because they'd been used to doing that. And obviously they're going to be, not all of them married their cousins, by the way, but obviously they're going to, I don't know the statistics. Not all of them maybe had that fear, but thinking of, well, if you're coming to a new massive amount of land, kind of the same size as Europe, and you know how stupid people who live under the aristocracy are, and you know that a lot of people, like you can, like a lot of people could just read the writing on the wall. They knew after the revolution, Europe was going to fall completely. They knew there was going to be mass starvation because these people can't do things independently. A lot of them, because they were so used to servitude, wanted a king. They wanted the church to tell them what to do. And so I think that a lot of the Germans really were like, we're going to go west like a motherfucker, and we're going to control the livestock because we can see that you're already just on the tit of Europe and you just got here. So that's my analysis of that so far. Talked about like the German culture of Masonic building and architecture. Didn't get too into that. Okay, so one of the smaller groups, now I'm on the Swiss. Oh, okay, and then the Swiss were able to bring like their cheese specialties. I'll quote myself here. Early immigrants would choose this mindset, working and thinking of how, wouldn't choose. I didn't go in and totally edit. Sorry, guys. Early immigrants wouldn't necessarily choose this mindset, working and thinking of how their life would affect their grandkids' freedom. People didn't want to hear their great-grandchildren facing the same tyranny they did back in Europe. I know just talk about the Swiss. Again, a lot of people would just start with farming and then they would evolve to do like business and government and other just kinds of business after farming, as is natural evolution for settlers. The Welsh were a funny group to do. I didn't know we had a lot of Welsh in particular history in the area, and they were like to read their quotes. I didn't realize how like in tune with nature the Welsh were, and it was funny. And I think this is one of the groups like in northern Wisconsin that was able to really jive well with the natives who were here because they had this love for animals and this respect for nature. And then the native groups were able to see like, oh, like this is actually like kind of different than like the basic business or political transaction we've been having. And I'll read a couple of those quotes because they were really beautiful people. They are beautiful people, but a quote from the book: "The farmland was a gift from heaven to people coming from Wales." If you do read my paper, I will edit it, and I do apologize. Again, I was quite upset that I was being told I couldn't publish this paper or present it because I did put a lot of work into it, and I loved doing it. So a lot of people left Wales again because it was a part in England where it was separate from the major cities of London and all that shit in the south, separate from Liverpool, and it was just like a nice coastal region. And so like that land was like, no, you may not move here. And so for Welsh people coming here, they were just happy to have a piece of land. So this is a Welsh settler from Iowa County, Dodgeville. I'm going to assume that's Wisconsin. His name was Thomas Evans. It is Wisconsin. Wisconsin is, this is Thomas Evans' quote, "Wisconsin is superior to all the states and the Canadas. It is a healthy country with wonderful water, prairie, and plenty of farmland. There is no work to be done cutting down large trees, and the land cost 5 shillings an acre. One can have it for a year without paying through preemption rights, and many have lived on farms here for 4 years without paying a penny." I'm going to assume the Germans helped cut the trees down. And then I learned about the Homestead Laws of 1862, encouraging more settlement and farming. I actually don't really understand why more people from major cities weren't able to be like, okay, well, do I want my kids to have an option? And I think a lot of people just were obsessed with the cities and then maybe like that comfort. Because it's interesting that like to see so many people like suffering in like New York and like other major cities not want to migrate. And again, maybe it was just like, well, that sounds boring, and we have like jazz music coming up here and opium. I don't know. And I think people kind of, because they are realizing that they have freedoms they never had before, and obviously with a lot of those freedoms and possibility comes visions. So maybe a lot of people just wanted to see their vision come through. But I don't know. You would expect these regions to be more populated. That's kind of like by this time. Okay, in 1900, there were just 11,000 Welsh in Wisconsin. They were known to abstain from alcohol, like I said earlier. Okay, so I love this story. There is a famous story of a Welshman named David Jones Davies surprising Minnesota's corn farmers who were dealing with a rodent issue in the form of gophers. The Minnesotans wanted to straight out exterminate all the gophers. Davies advised instead, quote, they were small creatures of the great creator, and that it would be more reasonable to save them and feed them by scattering the corn along the surface of the land amply enough so that there would be no need for the little things to be forced to destroy the crop, end quote. And they did so, and it was successful. For how long, who knows? So they were known for caring deeply for their animals. In 1889, a community of Welsh had realized that they should house their horses, exclaiming, quote, although the Bible teaches that it is godly to care for the food and comfort of the animals, I am surprised that so many rural churches compel their horses to remain outside in the exceptional weather for hours, summer and winter, while they themselves are in the chapel. And so they would build horse sheds. Also, the Welsh were known for their spirit of debate. I thought this was really fun. So they would debate philosophical ideas like, quote, who had done the most good for the world? The farmer, the businessman, or the artisan? And then they were also known for being strongly against slavery and servitude. And then you have one man in particular after the Civil War, a Black man named James D. Williams, who had been born into slavery in Virginia, and he moved to this region of Wisconsin to be a part of the Welsh community. I thought that was a cool story to mention. And then their mayor, they actually may not have been like a secret railroad up through like the Welsh community in particular. And I think other certain groups, because again, you had super small pockets up here. So in that secrecy, there was more safety. Then we talked about the Irish already. Oh, the Wisconsin book on the Irish had a lot of Irish work songs / slave songs, and they were hilarious. So one went, quote, in 1841, my corduroy breeches on, I put my corduroy breeches on, I put on to work upon the railway. I am weary of the railway. Poor Patty works on the railway. And then it was end quote. And it was just Irish railway worker. There were a lot of songs like that. And then it would just say the Irish should do a lot of jobs other people wouldn't do. Again, you could get a big group of them and just get them drunk. I don't know how many times Irish did work without pay, but that's somebody else's research project to do, that's for sure. And then some of them were more poetic. Sorry, I dated a half Irish person, and I don't want to say I regretted it because I learned a lot, but I have that bitterness in me still. So it's not personal at all. So a more poetic Irish man, I'll quote him too, to even it out. And this is more like the Irish who would get involved in politics and law. Quote, When boyhood's fire was in my blood, I read of ancient freemen from Greece and Rome, who bravely stood 300 men and 3 men. And then I prayed I yet might see our fetters rent in twain, and Ireland long a province be, a nation once again. And that's Thomas Davis. And so a lot of that, like spirit for freedom, again, because it was a savage island that wasn't conquered until England had, and I don't know, and I don't want to talk about Ireland anymore, so I'm gonna move on. But again, the Romans like wouldn't really conquer Ireland, and they had so many feuding kingdoms that were like, no, like we want to do our own thing. And I don't know when like Ireland was really conquered by England, but I think even it was just conquered kind of by their own people who went back and forth because they wanted to move on and grow in South America and in the islands, and they didn't just want to be in Ireland anymore, and they wanted that adventure. And I think a lot of like the other kings of Ireland would say like, no, stay here and let me control you. So it's just, so I liked that, the quotes of freedom, like from the Irish perspective, because I think they had a lot of like familial enslavement, I'll say. Okay, we did the Swiss. Now we're at the Swedes. So in 1850, the U.S. as a whole had only 4,000 Swedes. Only 100 existed in the whole state, Wisconsin, and I just thought that was like something to really think about, because we talking about like minorities and groups that don't get recognized in modern basic society. To think that you have this tiny country in Europe that just gets glossed over as white, and then it was like that was a crazy small group to live here. 100 Swedes, 4,000 in 1850. It also makes you wonder what was so good in Sweden that only 100 were like, or was the population that small? So they did a lot of textile production, fine arts, metals work, jewelry crafting. Many would go west for the gold rush. They had a lot of sharpshooters. A lot of the women would take up the Second Amendment. One Swede said, quote, "It was better to live like the Indians than to lead the hectic life that developed civilization demands. Their religion and concept of the happy hunting grounds were supposedly simpler and easier to grasp." And that was a Swede named Alstrom in the late 1800s. And I thought that was really novel that they had that perspective, like, and that would hold true to today. And so those were people thinking of their great grandkids and beyond. And then it was also documented that, so in the Sioux Uprising of 1862 and these massive massacres in Minnesota and Wisconsin caused a lot of fear for some immigrants, but the Swedes didn't have any documented, as this text was saying, conflicts with the Ojibwe or the indigenous people from the Great Lakes. They were seen as magnificent to the Swedish. And I wonder all these diplomatic things we don't get to hear about because they're not in writing, and if they don't get remembered or passed on because they're kind of like in the moment. But the Swedes and the Welsh, two groups that had a reverence for the native people, and that's to be mentioned. And again, they probably read like stories about them. Maybe they had tobacco, like because that came to Europe, to England in 1600. So maybe I don't know, maybe, and I don't know what else. I guess furs probably would have been really important to them. And then you imagine that they would have bought like fine arts. Again, if they were into fine arts and then the Ojibwe in the region were into fine arts, I'm sure those things maybe did trade and were at least talked about. But nonetheless, they had a strong reverence. One local Swede describes witnessing Ojibwe children in school. They were asking for tobacco and food, and he further described some learned to read and write just as the Swedish children, but their parents resisted English. So just like observing as the Swedish were learning a new language, that the Ojibwe were also learning this new language. And I like that they would say like resisted English. So they could tell that there was like a reasoning behind them not learning this language. And then they were noticing the things that were important to them. I wish we had more stories. Like that. I'm in Ojibwe, was Anishinaabe of Lake Superior class right now. And there's like nothing too new or novel about it. And it's a lot of, they just call any European white people, and then they just group themselves. They say, we all think this way. This is how we all think. And I don't like that. And I also don't like it because I have Native ancestry from Mexico. And you're talking about like the indigenous people of the Americas is kind of how it's referred to in the class, so the original people. And I don't think at all that my grandma in her culture where she lived in Yucatan, and my grandfather's in Jalisco or Mexico City, agree with anything you're saying. You don't even like acknowledge their culture or what that reality was like for, I guess, like the group term the Ojibwe call Mexican natives up here is Aztecs. You don't do that at all. And she wouldn't have called herself Aztec. Excuse me, viewer. I did bring it to you. It's right here. Also, like, pardon me. They also admit having like come from the East, and then they never recognize the Fox Tribe genocide in the class or other groups that were already here before they came from the East. So it's hard to be polite in that class, but it is a good challenge too. And then you did get I just watched a video where I did get to hear from like a bunch of different bands, and some of them did say different stuff, but it was like a PBS coverage, and then PBS just grouped them all together, and I was like, no, the Leech Lake guy just said that the translators, so the mixed race people would side with the Europeans. He just said that like the translators would often betray their own people, but then PBS just made the whole documentary about them all thinking the same and that white people all need to die. That was like the PBS like narrative editing. And I was like, wait, what the Leech Lake guy just said was vastly different from what everybody else just said. Does his opinion not matter? I've always had a good vibe about Leech Lake band people. I've only met like a small handful, but they're very independently minded. And it's just annoying too because it's not accurate history. Because they kept complaining about like the British, never mentioned the French. We're in Duluth. It's named after a Frenchman. Like, what? I'm in Cloquet, also French. Also, this was mainly French controlled for a while. And you just mentioned the British and in the whole what? You missed so many other groups that you had relationships with before the British got out here. So I commented that below on the video. And I really do like the challenge because it's like, yeah, let's talk about natives, but you don't get to threaten me or whatever if I'm not just agreeing with you to agree with you because you're Ojibwe. That's insulting. That's bigotry. So. We have to do an interview for this class. So I think I'll bring this up in the interview because I want to have that discussion and I don't want to be afraid to talk about basic ideas in history. So and that would be fun to do. One thing I will remember for my own ignorance, and this was on the quiz I just did, is that Native Americans, well, let's just say at least the group up here, all I think of this was a federal law. So Native Americans federally didn't have religious freedom until 1978. So this really is, and then the schools ran up until the late 80s, the boarding schools. And there were some gnarly, nasty people in those schools. So I need to remember these people, of course, they're going to have all this mistrust and only trust information, or they're going to want to have their own information. But propaganda is insidious, and you can just imagine them leaving the boarding schools and then joining in popular culture or wanting to go their own direction with academia, but then also being given this insidious propaganda to control their mindset in a massive group, like what happened with African Americans through the Democratic Party, who is the party of the KKK for the most part. So I need to remember that it is fairly new that they just got out of that boarding school culture, because we're only 2023, but it's also it was 40 years ago, and it just takes a quick conversation and a Google to learn. You never just go with one idea. You should always be challenging your ideas and your own history, especially if your language has been just demolished. You're going to want to keep up that debate. And so I am really excited to interview one member of the community and talk about things that do need to grow. Native medicine needs to grow. It needs to build a lot of wealth. And Native, I think that local, to protect with the wild rice and all these things that they want protected, the water, which has been poisoned more so than ever before in Lake Superior. You can look that up at there's a water testing website that you can just look up your zip code. by whatever body of water you live in. And if it's a part of the research project, they update like the chemicals and shit that's in the water. And Lake Superior is one that has PFOAs have gone way up. Other petrochemicals and shit just like goes downhill because Lake Superior is downhill from Duluth, way downhill, and for other regions that the lake touches, so goes right in there. And so I think that they need to build wealth, to build control, and to maintain protecting the water and everything that goes along with it. So, yeah. Like you can take, and growing up here, our water, like I would visit California and I would come back and be like, ew, San Francisco water, ew, Temecula water, gross. And then you come back and you have a crisp glass of Duluth, Minnesota water. It is not like that anymore. And a lot of people tell me that, especially people who are like from the cities, like moved up here, who would like notice how good the water it is. It doesn't taste good anymore. It's gross. All right, I'm going to wrap this up. Probably get a snack. The Swedish preferred sheep. Fun fact. And sheep meat, and they would do the wool, the cheese. So yummy. The Swedish woman would do a bunch of textile stuff, cottage industry, business, knitting socks. So they had a microeconomy that really flourished with that. Sorry for all the spell checks. Okay, the Danes. I'm just going to go through the whole thing. Because I did want to have just presented it already. Okay. So the Danes are so weird. So my grandma, Aletha, like I'd mentioned, so she was, my dad would say she was half Danish, but doing Ancestry, I want to say, I don't know. And then this is where like nationality and ethnicities for countries that border each other get really confusing for myself. And I wonder if those countries themselves, because they are still so controlling of their genetics, that well, their Swedishness, their Danishness. So I wonder if they have like an algorithm themselves so that when people go to do their DNA, and I've seen mine change like many times actually on a massive scale between like Scottish English, Irish, and then between like Swedish, Danish, Norwegian. And I've seen like those percentages really like swing in like, I want to say even one was like a 5 to 10% like swing. And then now it's been stationary for a while, and I've had it since 2016. So I wonder if those countries say like, hey, if it's like, I think you know what I'm saying, like to try to say like, no, it's only within these bounds, and then the DNA has to be from like this time, and then you can, in your algorithm ancestry, call that Swedish. I just wonder if that's anything at all that exists. Okay, so the Danes. The Danes in the Industrial Revolution had a huge explosion of population. In 1860, in America, I think the Danish population, I didn't decipher if it was Wisconsin or America, it was just 1,000. I love this quote. This was from a Danish farmer in 1861 named Andreas Fredriksson. And he said, "Here, all of our neighbors are Danes. this is him being quoted in Denmark. But out there, most will be Americans, and I prefer them. My grandma's a really cold woman. So they were really interested in innovation. And then they also struggled with English. One Dane said, quote, "For us older folks, trying to speak English is about like breaking through a wall." And that was Rasmus Sorensen. And that was another thing I genuinely learned from my project is, oh my God, yeah, none of these immigrants spoke English, because why would you have spoken English? You spoke German or Danish or Finnish, whatever that sounds like. And then how can you know your rights if you can't read or speak English or tell your children? Your children are telling you because they're going to school learning English, and they're telling you. You don't know. You don't understand English. Or it's whatever your understanding was at the time. Mm-hmm. And then so a lot of like women, and again, I don't know what like the death rate in childbirth look like, what the fertility rates look like. I have a theory that I think a lot of infertility was happening in the Industrial Revolution just because none of the chemicals had a known side effect. In fact, straight out poisons were thought to be medicine, like radium in the 1900s, and all kinds of other things. So the Danes didn't send a lot of women this way. And you had that was true with like the Irish. It said like the men and the women would migrate like separately. So you would have a massive group of people come. They might have no women. And then, yeah. And so in 1876, a farmer from Jackson County exclaimed this tragedy, saying, quote, "Genuine Danish girls are just as scarce as mills here. If you come, get married immediately." And again, if you didn't speak any other language, you like would have to find the person who also spoke your language. And so I thought that was such a cute quote. So like Danish women were scarce. And that's why I was like, and I'm just doing it on observation. And like, I just know my grandma and what she looked like and what some of our ancestors looked like. But oh my gosh, I swear Kalispell, Montana has some of the most Danes per capita in the entire country. And I could be wrong, but I think a lot of them, and again, like he's saying, imagine you're a Danish woman, you come out here and you're like, oh my God, I gotta go. Like, cause like people are like on you, and then they're gonna be on your kids because your little cute Danish little girls are gonna be like literally 1 in a million. And then you see all these people like, oh, I'm going to marry her when I'm older, looking at your 4-year-old. So I think a lot of women strategize that way to protect their children and grandchildren, knowing, oh my God, they're like hunting babies out here. We got to go. And again, this is like our president in the 1800s, one of them. So Grover Cleveland, it's a little later. So I think the trend had already been set, but Grover Cleveland had a baby order bride. Her name was Frances Cleveland. So when he was in his fucking 40s, whatever it was, it might even just have been his 30s. We'll say 40s. So he had a woman sell him her child, her baby, So this woman came to America from Europe, Eastern Europe, I want to say, sell him her child. He raised her. They made up a story. He raised her as his daughter. They're not related, but he raised her. No, it was like it was more like I'm your godfather. Like, I'm looking out for you, child. And oh my gosh, we've fallen in love when you were 20. It was magical. Good thing you already know French and German. That's already relevant for the politics I've planned. And that's she was literally trained to be the wife he needed for his political adventures. And so the trend of building a wife from childhood had already been started. So I think a lot of women read the tea leaves and went to Flathead Valley. That's my guess. Same with Native women, because that was becoming a real game piece. So it was like some Native women were like, oh, our own people are selling us, and these other people might have plans to do the same. Let's also go that way. So Kalispell, Montana also has a lot of beautiful Native gals. Well, like in their ancestry, they're not full Native. Sorry, that's something too. Like when I'm not meaning to like degrade anyone, but I love seeing different features, and like we're all so mixed race, and we really are a melting pot. And so I love noticing like, oh, all these kind of like mixed with European, these kind of natives kind of look this way. The Comanche like mixed look this way. Geronimo's ancestors kind of look this way. And I loved noticing ethnicity more while I was studying the history, because it was beautiful to see everybody's face. And I loved the Native reservations I drove through. I had no idea that Fort Peking was like an iron goddess's fortress. They had these huge iron teepees, and I loved just how I felt driving through there. They had a bunch of wild dogs that I didn't know if they were coyotes or dogs. And one of them like came up to me. It was just like, it reminded me of a wild dog when I was up north as a little child, and I loved it because I forgot about that animal. And you know, when you're connected to an animal as a child, you're like, that's your best friend. And so that was cool to see that puppy in Fort Peking and the iron teepees. And then the Blackfeet reservation city, just like a cool group of people. And I didn't really get to spend time in any of these places, but I loved it. And when I moved down south, I definitely want to drive back out to like Crow Nation, I think, check out these other areas, and then brush up on my French Indian War and War of 1812 Native American battles, because that'll be fun to read the history, then go to those battlegrounds and have like a lunch or a picnic and just spend the day hanging out there where that happened. Oh, then we have the Poles. Poland was an interesting country to learn about here. Another pretty small group in Wisconsin. Okay, so the Poles had some medicine, which I actually loved this. So a lot of women would just like harvest plants for tea, which I thought was cool to learn about the Poles in the area. And then they would do other practices with like certain parts of animals, and milk was considered a cure-all well through the 1900s for Poles in America. Ground pepper and whiskey was a popular tonic. So was vinegar. The Poles would also have cures for the common cold with chamomile, flowers. I loved learning about. I definitely wanted. I just want more time to study everybody, and so the polls will. My heart just like I just want to know more. It's just so beautiful, and it's like it is true. Like vinegar is like a great medicine. Chamomile flowers are an awesome medicine. I've never had ground pepper and whiskey. I'm okay on that for a while. The fins. So I didn't realize. Oh, so there were small pockets of fins in the colonies. I'm so sorry. This is a quote from 1683. William Penn saying of these early groups in the colonies, quote, "The first planters in these parts were the Dutch, in soon after the Swedes, then the Finns. The Dutch applied themselves to traffic, the Swedes and Finns to husbandry." And again, these must just be like 1683. Parliament is about to overtake the King of England himself by 1699. And then the parliaments of all of Europe actually are undermining their aristocracies as well by that time. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, is that the Dutch East India Company? They've become like super powerful very quickly. Hence the desire for parliaments to say, nutmeg it is. And like, you get sick of your boss and then you have like a new boss that's like, we're so cool. We're the Dutch East India Trading Company. Sugar for everyone. Like you're going to just want to change, not necessarily for the better, just a change. Yeah. So that's kind of, I forgot about that part. Okay, so the Danes, William Penn is saying the Danes, the Swedes, and the Finns. We're getting started. I have so much to learn about American history still, where I think I'll study it till I die, probably. And this is why I really do look forward to educating my own children, just because of what they'll like challenge me on as I try to solidify on some things. Because, oh my gosh, our history there's a lot to think about. There's a lot. It's only been like 280 years. It's not that long. Just wrapping up here. I think, yeah, I'm at my 15 of 16 pages. Thank you for joining me on this adventure. I would love a comment. Just whatever you have to add, your thoughts. I love just exploring motives in history and relating them back to the modern era as well, or just whatever. Also just like facts, any fun facts. Correct me if you need to. I encourage that as well. Between 1864 and 1920, the U.S. received 300,000 Finns, most of which were after the 1900s. Oh, they had like little fun facts in these books too. So the Finns preferred rye like the Swiss. So they preferred rye grain and bread. It is so hard to find good rye bread at the store. I have some in my freezer right now, but it's not like nobody really makes it. Like pumpernickel and rye. My grandpa really liked pumpernickel. It's just so good. They also preferred wool. And they were just known for being very humble, proud people who, quote, use little iron, for they will build and hardly use any other tool but an axe. I loved that. I'm going to wrap it up there, as long as it's my last group, because I don't want to leave out any of the ethnic groups. You know, I understand this isn't edited. And then I went into the women of Wisconsin because, yeah, the suffragette movement in Wisconsin was great. Also, reading a little bit of that book and like the political, petty, tit for tat bullshit that went on in Wisconsin. Again, women from all these ethnic groups I just read to you wanting to control the future of the nation. So there was just some pathetic fucking bullshit in this really awesome book, actually, that covered like so much of just women in Wisconsin, and I had no idea. And then I was like, oh, well, I'm glad I did do a year and a half of schooling through the University of Superior, because just to learn about Wisconsin and to put myself in that immersive place was enlightening. Thank you for joining me. I'm going to go have some of this delicious food that, you know, just whatever I want to go get from the grocery store. And I appreciate that. Yeah. I'm pretty hungry. I did a good workout and I've been getting better at going regularly. It just feels so good to do that, especially in the wintertime when I sit through so much throughout the day. So I wish I had a railway to work on. All right. Thank you, viewers. Look forward to your comments.